So it's generally accepted that a stereo pair of microphones in a nice space is the best way to record string instruments like the cello, like the violin, whatever. But what if you're stuck in a tiny little bedroom and you still want to get that juicy audio? Well, today we're going to explore using a stereo pair of microphones in different configurations in a small, tiny bedroom. I'm going to record a spoken example, and then I'm going to record a played cello example as well. I'm going to be using these two Line Audio CM4 small condenser microphones set up in an XY pattern on my Shure A27M stereo bar. However, if you have a product such as tried and true Zoom H2N or one of its older siblings, the H4 or H6N, those all have XY capability as well, so this will apply to you. On most of these Zoom products, they have a little dial that'll let you turn it to XY position, and usually using one of the knobs or the doodads on the device, you can set that angle to be within the parameters that I'm going to be testing today. Now, what's so bad about a small room? Well, microphones are really good at picking up reflections of sound off of objects like walls and etc. This is generally called reverb, and if you're in a really nice room, like a concert hall or like a wood paneled space that has nice big ceilings, this is generally desirable. You want to capture as much of that natural reverb as you can to produce the most realistic recording possible. Now, in a small room like this, you tend to get this slapback effect where the sound, it'll bounce off the drywall and then right back into the capsule of the microphone, producing this kind of dry and bright tone. Also, sometimes sound needs space to bloom. It needs actual distance to be able to reach its full potential. And sometimes in a small room, you just don't have the luxury of setting up the microphone far enough away so it can sound boxy or a little bit constrained. All these effects can actually be mitigated with EQ and a little bit of reverb, but once it's recorded, it's always going to be there. You're never going to get rid of it entirely. Now, normally when recording in a small room such as this, I'm going to reach for a close mic such as this, Audio-Technica Pro 35. Now, this thing hooks into something that looks a little bit like this, and it clips right on to the tailpiece of your cello, and you can get it really close to the body and help prevent any kind of pickup from that kind of nasty room tone that I just talked about. Generally, these are a super or hypercardioid position, meaning that they just have a smaller cone of what they're actually going to pick up, and I mean, the microphone itself is very small. So it's going to be picking up a very small little area of sound. Now, while it's nice that it doesn't pick up that room reflection, I will say if you're recording for like an album and not doing just live performance, you are going to need to do some processing. It tends to sound very boxy and very like almost like you're putting your ear right up against your cello. That could be good, but just keep that in mind. If you want a more natural cello tone with something like this, you're going to have to use some EQ and some reverb. Now, using a stereo pair or a device that lets you have stereo pair capability can be advantageous even in a small room such as this with that room reflection, mainly because it does give you a more realistic tone. Also, if you're using a Zoom device such as this one or one of its bigger siblings, there's less wires and less setup. So if that's part of your workflow, that could be advantageous as well. So enough talk. Let's set these microphones up. Let's see how it sounds. So for our first attempt here, I've got the microphone set 90 degrees on top of each other, 1 foot away from my cello. I've pointed it at sort of the middle of the play area, so to speak, between the bridge and the fingerboard to get, I like that place on my cello. I think it sounds the best mixture of bow noise and resonance. It's supposed to just point to get right at the bridge. Again, a foot away from my instrument. We're going to see how this sounds. We've got this small room. 2 extra bits of information that I'm going to throw at you right now. I'm using my modern cello because I feel like this is going to cover the most bases for most of you listening to and watching this video. Modern cello, modern strings, modern bow. You know, nothing crazy, nothing that historical hoo-ha that I've got laying around. The second thing is, I'm in a room with windows, which probably most of you are, and I would like for you to also listen for the duration of this. You know, there's background noise. There's people with leaf blowers outside. You know, people with like making noise or doing stuff. These microphones will pick that kind of stuff up. So keep that in mind, okay? For example, right now I think there's a little bit going on. Yeah. So, anyways, let's play. Here we have 110 degrees set off axis. Let's do it. And here we have 130 degrees. Same position. Here we are at 2 feet away at 90 degrees. Let's see how this sounds. This is how it sounds when I'm talking. Talking. Let's go. Here we are at 110 degrees off axis. It's going to sound a little wider this time. Let's hear how it sounds. Okay, so this is the widest, 130 degrees, pretty wide. It's going to sound even wider. We're going to pick up a little bit more of the room sound. All right, let's hear how this sounds now. 130 degrees, 2 feet away from my cello. All right, so here we are again at 90 degrees, 3 feet away from my cello. It's going to be probably sounding a little bit brighter. You're going to be hearing a little bit more of the reflection off of the walls. Kind of hear that? Definitely hear that a little more than 2 and 1 foot respectively. Okay, so how to switch mic stands. Let's give this a go. So here we are at 110 degrees off axis. It's going to be a little wider, just a bit. All right, here we go. Okay, and here we are at 130 degrees. notice the positioning. I'm trying to get it as close as possible, but as it gets farther away, it's going to get a bit more approximate, all right? Okay, let's hear how this sounds. Okay, so these are the microphones set 4 feet away from me at 90 degrees. This is the room tone. It's probably the vocals might sound a little bit more far away. We might be picking up a little bit more of that kind of boxy room tone as we get closer to the back wall, farther away from me. Okay, so 90 degrees. This is what it sounds like talking. Let's do a little bit of playing. So here we are at 110 degrees off axis. This is 4 feet away from my cello. It's probably going to sound very similar, but it's going to be a little bit wider. So here we are, finally 4 feet away from my instruments. Small room, 130 degrees off axis. This is going to sound a little bit wider if you're listening in headphones. Again, I'm very fortunate to live in an environment with other talented musicians, but if you are doing recording with this kind of microphone, it is worth keeping in mind all of that background noise that you hear will be in your recording. So if you're trying to record your single, record that nice Bach album, maybe invest in a space that does not have other people around it. All right, let's hear how it sounds. Sharp. Okay, and here we are. Last but not least, 5 feet away from me. This is pretty much as far as I think I'm going to get in this room, just because there's some furniture in the way. But also, I think in a room this size, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find a way to get more than this realistically away from you. This is what it sounds like. It's probably going to sound a little bit far away. You're probably going to be picking up a lot of that wall that it's right up against. Let's do some recording. This is 90 degrees off axis. Let's hear how this sounds. Okay, here we go. This is 110 degrees off axis, 5 feet away. It's probably going to sound a little similar, but it's going to be a little bit wider. Let's hear it. Okay, last but not least, finally, 5 feet away, 130 degrees off axis. I think whatever this recording ends up being, I'm going to know one thing. I need to practice playing F sharps in tune, And it doesn't really matter if you buy a really long headphone extension cable if all it does is just get tangled in every single other wire that's in your studio. Word to the wise. All right, let's play. All right, so I went back, I did some listening, and took a couple of notes. We're gonna get to that in a second. I'm just gonna hit you with kind of my general reflection of how that went. First off, I actually think it sounded pretty good for being in this tiny little room that's not very well treated. I definitely noticed background noise bleed. If you are in an area where you can get kind of like a studio quality silence, then this sort of configuration would be awesome. But I think it's just worth saying that when you start to get into these kind of more stereo microphone recording techniques, it's gonna pick up everything, which is by design. If that's not something that interests you, then I would really recommend going for something more like that Audio-Technica microphone I showed at the beginning, because that's gonna definitely pick up less noise. I'm gonna do a video kind of detailing my setup on that at another time. Also, another thing I noticed was as the microphone got farther away from the cello and closer to the ceiling, we sort of lost that bass noise, and then we got more treble noise. And that's worth saying. It's not a good or a bad thing. If you have a particularly dark instrument and you need it to sound a little bit brighter, spacing that microphone a little bit farther and higher away from it will brighten it up in the recording stage, and vice versa. If you find yourself with a super, super bright instrument, maybe getting it a little bit closer to you might be more worth it. In general, I felt like the money zone was like 2 to 3 feet, 1 feet being a little bit more punchy, but 2 to 3 sounding, I think, the most realistic. I think a good middle ground was always 110, except for a couple of the farther ones. I think it just made it sound a little bit weak, and I think 130 is a really cool effect. It is definitely wide. You definitely need to be listening to those with headphones that are capable of doing stereo audio, because you'll really hear a big difference between 90 and 130. Okay, let's get to it. So 1 foot away, 90 degrees. I felt like in general, this one had really good vocals. You could really pick up kind of the bass in my voice, which is kind of nice when the microphone's a little closer to your face. However, I did think it was a little bit boxy, and also I noticed you pick up a lot of that bow noise sizzle. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, that's definitely there. That's something to keep in mind. And really not a lot of room noise, not a lot of reverb at all. I would say if you have a particularly bad room, like worse than mine, just like bare walls, no furniture, this is probably gonna be what you want, because then you can always add in a little bit of reverb later, but you can't really take it out once it's there. Now, 110 degrees, I felt like it actually was a little bit less boxy. I liked this one the best. It was a bit more round, and it was a little bit less concentrated, but I felt like it was a nice balance between kind of that straight ahead monotone and like kind of a little bit rounder, but a bit more believable in a way. So I would say 110 degrees, definitely my favorite. 130 degrees had the best feel to sound, and it was wide. It sounded very interesting. It just sounded kind of interesting, you know what I mean? It didn't sound very realistic. It sounded kind of like wide. So if you're going for wide, I definitely would try and get that 130 degrees. So moving on to 2 feet, I felt like you definitely lose a little bit of that bass. That proximity effect really goes away. We definitely are getting a little bit less bow noise though, and I felt like actually 2 and 3 feet for my cello had a really nice blend. This kind of is a bright-ish cello. It's got kind of a very direct tone, especially the way that I have it set up. It's a little bit more of a kind of a workhorse machine where it's a little bit more balanced. It doesn't have as much darkness or brightness. It kind of is riding somewhere in the middle, which is by design. I felt like this was a pretty good balance. And especially in 110, I felt like it had a little bit more middle to it, actually. It had a little bit more of like a balance. So again, I'm siding with that 110. Now, 130, I felt like this one, it had a really nice field of sound, but it kind of just sounded a little bit far away to me. I don't really know why. So if you were trying to like do a recording where you wanted to make it sound like your cello was a little bit farther away, but you were in kind of a smaller room, I would say go with 2 feet and do 130 degrees, space it out. But I think that if you were just going for like a recording and you had, access to a room like this, I would say definitely 110 degrees, 2 feet away was a really good one. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I think actually with number 2 and number 3, the vocals were pretty similar. You'll notice they get a little bit brighter, just a little bit brighter as it goes on. You can kind of start to hear the wall behind you, and I'm gonna get to that in number 4 because I think that that's actually the most exaggerated when it comes down to the vocals. But like they were decent, they were passable. It wasn't obviously like a lav mic or anything like that, but it's okay, it's okay. Now, this one again, I felt like this one had a little bit of a better bloom to it. And so I think that 3 90 degrees and 2 110 are actually my 2 favorites, because 3, it was a little bit direct. We didn't have that bow noise, but I felt like actually the sound had just enough time to bloom and it captured that before it started interacting with the walls of the space and coming back and sort of brightening and brightening. I felt like this was a really nice balance. If you have an instrument that you feel like needs a little bit more space to bloom, I would say try more around 3 feet, see where that sounds. And 110 degrees and 130, I didn't actually really like them at 3 feet. I felt like it just sort of got dissipated. But to each their own. Maybe it was just because I was listening to a bunch of them in a row and I just didn't like it. Now, 4 feet, this is when we start to get to those reflections. I would say go back and listen, and you almost hear like a delay effect where it like slaps on the wall. It's like a fraction of a second. You can kind of hear it. It's like, that's what I'm talking about. I would say go back and listen for that because it's pretty apparent. And what that does is it really brightens the sound up. We're getting these reflections, we're getting this bounce back. And I felt like this is the moment when it starts to get a little bit thin and a little bit brittle. But I actually didn't mind it as much as I thought I was gonna mind it. I tried a little demo of these positions with my other cello, which is much brighter. And when I had it at 4 feet, it was almost unbearable in terms of like you play an open string and it would sound like sawtooth. It was crazy. But on this cello, actually, I felt like it was fine, if not just a bit brittle. I felt like the vocals also were just kind of meh. I would say if you have to position the microphones 4 feet away from you, you probably should be working on getting another microphone for your voice. I just think that that's a good plan in general, but if you have to roll with that, it's fine. Just keep in mind it's gonna be a little bit bright and you're definitely gonna be hearing the room behind you when you do it. Now, I felt like actually in this configuration, 130 was actually a little bit too wide for me. It kind of sounded a little bit washed out, but I felt like 110 was a good balance between the two. I felt like it opened up the sound just enough to kind of mask some of that brittleness, and it sort of made it sound a little bit more rounded and realistic. And finally, the last one, 5 feet, which I thought, again, I was gonna hate, but I actually didn't hate it too much. Gotta say, didn't sound horrible in my ears. I think this is really low. You really start to hear that nasalness. It's not necessarily brightness, it's nasal, right? So that's what you want to avoid. As you start to get far away and high up and closer to kind of corners and ceilings and stuff like that, you start to get this nasal sort of kind of tone. And that could be good if you have the right instrument. But I think for this instrument, it just kind of made it sound a little bit like nasal and kind of not amazing. I would not pick this if I had to. Also, I definitely started to notice those open strings, and anything that was sort of a little bit more resonant was like, there was like this little threshold, and it would just cross right over that, and it would just be rough and harsh and like raspy almost. And I was playing exactly the same way. I'm playing on equipment that kind of is designed not to do that, and it's really interesting that you get it close to the ceilings and the walls and stuff like that, and it really brightens up stuff like that, really just makes it pop right into the microphone. And so, I felt like as it got wider even, like it sort of got brighter in a way. So I didn't really particularly love the other configurations of the microphones. I thought it kind of all sounded sort of bright, and I would definitely choose to bring it in a little bit closer if I had the option. Well, that was a lot. If you made it this far of the video, thank you very much. If you like this kind of stuff, hit me with a like, hit me with a subscribe. I'm going to try and make a little bit more of these videos because it's really good practice for me to sit there and, do the 90, 110, 130 degrees configuration over and over again. I would love, though, if you had an opinion on any of these, leave a comment and tell me what you think. My ears are different. than everyone else's, and it would be really interesting to hear what you guys think of just like the general sound and which ones you preferred.